the issue of the resource curse is a clear and present danger for Namibia. And as the acting MD of Namibia said earlier in the morning, we should definitely not underestimate the dangers that come from the resource curse. It does mean, obviously, in economic terms, that we could actually see slow economic growth, lack of diversification, and so on, leading to social problems. And we know from other countries that these have actually led to conflict, in economic instability, and lasting environmental damage. And in general, oil and gas-rich countries are more authoritarian, less democratic, more prone to conflict. And I don't want to go into detail, and we have speakers here from Angola and Nigeria later in the program, but Angola and Nigeria are two clear examples. In 10 years, Namibia is projected to be the third biggest oil producer in sub-Saharan Africa after Nigeria and Angola. In recent times, they've actually been trading places in terms of who's producing the most barrels per day. But if we development index, Nigeria is down as 163rd, Angola is 148th, and Namibia is 139th. So even now, without oil, we are ahead in terms of human development of those countries that have had oil and have been producing oil for some decades. So the other thing that is often now mentioned in association with the resource curse is the pre-source curse. So that's what happens, that's the stage we're in now. Basically, all these incredibly high expectations that we've mentioned already, everybody increasing the size of their families and expecting early retirement, expecting cash grants and so on. These are jokes, I know, and we've laughed at them, but we have to actually manage these expectations very carefully, because it's a common situation in many countries where there is oil that expectations are unrealistically high. And this leads to over-optimistic forecasts in terms of the performance of the economy, and particularly in terms of the revenue coming into government. And that's, of course, when the temptation comes in for governments to start borrowing at unsustainable levels. So we have to see those warning signs at the moment and make sure that they don't happen. So the loss of, this can lead to negative policy developments. Again, a number of global examples and case studies we could go into. But generally, when the pre-source case starts to happen, we have seen a loss of fiscal discipline, particularly in the budgeting, and all too often this leads to a mass sense of public disappointment later on in the process, that things have not been realised as they expected, has a knock-on effect on democracy and people's belief in the system. So we're now entering a very tricky phase of policy and legal reform. Petroleum Act for Exploration and Production and the one that deals with taxation are both going to be facing some kind of overhaul, some kind of amendments. We might get more light on that as the conference progresses. Are we going to have a local content act? How do we translate the local content policy into legislation and regulation? And of course, what maybe IPPR is most concerned about is meeting the current global standards on transparency and accountability. So I'm not going to spend long on local content policy because it's going to be addressed elsewhere in the program. But essentially, as has been mentioned, the main immediate benefit that we're going to see once production of oil starts is large cash infusions into the treasury, into government coffers. And of course, that's a real boon and that's a real benefit. But we have to put that against the fact that what we have seen in Namibia is that a dramatic loss of trust in public institutions, in government over the last 10 years. How do we know this? From the Afrobarometer surveys that are done regularly on every 2 to 3 years. We've gone from having one of the most trusted administrations in Africa more to being the kind of a norm of a lack of trust. And of course, this is not just Namibia, it's a global phenomenon. People are losing their trust and their confidence in their governments. So in order to make these oil discoveries work for Namibia, it's very crucial that we do have this local content policy and that Namibians can see how they can participate in meaningful ways as suppliers of goods and services for the industry. The local content policy itself, and there's a quote there from the local content policy, and also from what the Minister said in previous speeches. So there's one quote from his speech at the local content policy workshop of a couple of months ago, but also he reiterated the same points this morning. So our big concern really, there's lots of aspects of local content to discuss, but we want to make sure that this is not seen as a gateway for corruption. So we need to consider anti-corruption clauses in the contracts that spell out the behaviour expected from contracting partners. We need to have dedicated and independent oversight body for local content policy. We need to have pre-approved local suppliers vetted for clean track records. That's really important because we don't want to see overnight briefcase companies being created connected to the political elites or politicians entering at this point to gain the benefits. This has to be a fair and level playing field, and that means that procurement regulations have to be very fair throughout. We haven't actually mentioned the issue of beneficial ownership today, but it's absolutely crucial for a number of reasons that Namibia tackles this issue of revealing who the real owners of businesses are and making sure that is on record and publicly available. I'm told that this is our Achilles heel in terms of the possibilities of avoiding grey listing because our business registration system is in a mess. And we're nowhere near up to standard on the global requirements in terms of beneficial ownership. So we have to make sure that this is applied in the oil and gas sector and that we avoid awarding contracts to foreign companies. And there should be transparent reporting. We need to know the companies involved, how many people they're employing, the number of foreigners, the number of Namibians, and also the exact kind of services that they are supplying so that this can be checked. Very important, also hasn't been mentioned, last year we passed an access to information law. The President has already signed it into law. The implementation stage is starting now with the Ministry of Information and Communication Technology. We expect an Access to Information Commissioner to be appointed, if not late this year, then early next year, and the implementation is to start. So this is going to affect us all, and I think in a good way, it's going to be transformative in terms of opening up the information landscape in Namibia. But I just want to point to one section, 33.1. I'll just read it out to you. A public entity must proactively disclose information produced by or in relation to the public entity within 30 days after production or receipt of the information by publishing. By publishing all contracts, all licenses, all permits, all authorizations, all public-private partnerships granted by the entity. The public entity is essentially, it's all the owners, offices, ministries, agencies, and including the public enterprises. So I don't think people have realized the gravity of that particular part of the Access to Information law. And I want to stress two words there. Must. So there's no equivocation. They have to publish. And secondly, proactively. So it's not a question of waiting for some pesky researcher or journalist to approach and say, we want to see this information. It has to be proactively, presumably on government websites, published by government. So proactive disclosure is a key theme in the Access to Information law. And just to quickly note that private sector should also read the Act carefully because it does apply to the private sector. It's more limited in terms of the amount of information that needs to be released, but it is particularly, as this quote from the General Principles says, is in relation to the protection of fundamental human rights. My last page, I'm glad that the EITI has already been mentioned. So the EITI is important because it's actually in the Harambe Prosperity Plan 2 that Namibia should consider joining the EITI and or review all the laws and regulations in terms of EITI standards. So, and actually they went further than just oil and gas and extractive industry. They also included fishing and forestry as well. And as I say, the government is taking this seriously. The Ministry of Mines has appointed consultants who have been working and consulting for several months now. They have their validation workshop for the report on Monday the 21st of August. And then the recommendations on what we need to do in terms of joining the EITI will then go to Cabinet. So this is a very serious prospect for the government and the private sector. Very briefly, why is it important? It's about contract transparency, about releasing economic data like the production figures, the revenue that comes out of oil and gas, and for government also how that revenue is utilised. And an important aspect of EITI is it also has a multi-stakeholder approach. We like it, we think it should be adopted. We think civil society can play a role in that multi-stakeholder approach, although we acknowledge that we need to build up our capacity. At the moment, EITI has plus 50 member countries, and I think that's a bit higher than the 53 I've listed there, and also 60 supporting companies. And the good news, I think, about that is that all of the companies involved in the Orange Basin, where all the action is happening now, are supporting companies of the EITI. So Shell, Total Energies, and also Chevron and Woodside, who are in the process of moving into the Orange Basin. They're all supporting companies of the EITI. So I know people don't like to talk about contract transparency in the private sector very much, but it is the way things are going. We're going to have to address these issues. There's increasingly public demand for transparency. So I think I will just move on to my last slide, which is basically just a quote that we like to use, and I think this is going to be key in terms of the transparency and accountability that we need. Sunlight is the best disinfectant, which was said by a US Supreme Justice in the last century, but it definitely applies. We need to rule out irregularities and corruption, and the way we can do that most effectively is to exercise and implement transparency and accountability. So thank you very much.